Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. I'm delighted to welcome you to our 20th anniversary program featuring Nikole Hannah-Jones. I'll introduce Nikole in just a moment, but first I want to briefly comment on the occasion of the Institute's 20th. Many of us had the opportunity to celebrate back in May when we were joined by our founding dean, Drew Kilbin-Faust, for virtual Radcliffe Day. Drew and I explored the history of the Institute and that of its predecessor, Radcliffe College. We also looked ahead to Radcliffe's future as a unique institute for advanced study, one animated by the conviction that vibrant interdisciplinary exchange is critical to advancing public discourse and to discerning innovative solutions to complex problems. If you missed the conversation, a video of it is available on our website. Of course, none of the accomplishments of the past 20 years, nor the ambitious plans we've laid for the future would be possible without the generosity of our friends and supporters. I'm grateful to the Dean's Advisory Council members, to members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society, and to all our annual donors who help keep Radcliffe programming free and open to the public. Thank you. Were we together in Radcliffe Yard, I'd suggest we raise a glass to the next 20 years. But for now, please accept my warmest and sincere thanks. We'll drink to that later. This afternoon's program is a fitting marker in more ways than one. It is presented as a part of the presidential initiative on Harvard and the legacy of slavery, launched by President Larry Bacow late last year. That initiative is anchored here at the Radcliffe Institute, and it is emblematic of our vital role within the university. I'm honored to welcome President Bacow and members of the faculty committee guiding this work. Thank you for being here. Our featured guest today, Nikole Hannah-Jones, has catalyzed a national conversation about the legacies of slavery in the United States. She is the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist behind the New York Times Magazine's 1619 Project. And before joining the Times, Nikole worked as an investigative reporter at ProPublica and at the Oregonian. Nikole's 1619 Project was released as a special issue of the Times Magazine in August of 2019, the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia. The project has since expanded to include a symposium at the Smithsonian, a podcast, a high school curriculum, and much more. It has achieved a level of reach and impact that most journalists can only dream of, or most academics for that matter. That success speaks not only to the importance of the work itself, but also to pressing needs of our time. We find ourselves at a moment of reckoning. Recent tragedies have again laid bare centuries of systemic racism, profound injustice, and chronic inaction. We've also witnessed powerful demands for change articulated by new and broad coalitions nationwide. To seize this opportunity for progress, we must engage thoughtfully and fearlessly with the questions confronting our nation. We cannot dismantle what we do not understand. And we cannot understand the contemporary injustice we face unless we reckon honestly with our history. Nikole, through her incisive reporting, helps us do precisely that, and I'm simply thrilled to have her here. Now for some logistics. In a moment, Nikole and I will begin our conversation. At any point during the program, you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your own questions for Nikole. Now, we have an audience of more than 3,000 viewers, so I do ask you to keep your questions brief so that we can work through as many of those as possible. With that, let's dive in. Now, Nikole, the 1619 Project, as I said, has received remarkable success, reach, and influence. And I thought we would start off by asking you what prompted you to take on this project, and what do you think the effort has illuminated for so many Americans?
Well, thank you so much for hosting the conversation, and thank you for Harvard and the Radcliffe Institute for this talk. So what led me to do this project? It's there's a longer version and a shorter version, and I'll try to truncate it a bit. But I've been thinking about the year 1619 literally since I was in high school, which was, a few years ago. That's when I first came across a date in a book called Before the Mayflower. And I came across the date in a period of self-study. It wasn't a book that my high school or any class had ever taught me. And the book talks about the year 1619, and it's called Before the Mayflower because, of course, the white lion that carried the first enslaved Africans to British North America arrived a year before the Mayflower, and yet every American child learns about the Mayflower in 1620, and no American child, including me, had been taught about the year 1619. So even as a high school student, I really understood the power of that erasure, and that erasure was intentional, and it felt deeply empowering to me as a high school student to know that our people had actually been here for that long, and I wondered why no one ever bothered to teach that to us. So fast forward a few years to the end of 2018, and I'd been thinking a lot about that this anniversary was approaching, the 400th anniversary of American slavery, and that like so many moments in Black American history and in the history involving slavery, it was going to pass, and there was probably going to be no national recognition. Most Americans had never heard of the date 1619. And I just knew that my working at the New York Times presented a tremendous opportunity to do something about that. And I started to think of what could possibly give justice to 400 years of marginalized history. And that's when I thought about pitching a project that would not be just about the past, but that would do what I feel like all of my work for the last 2 decades has tried to do, which is to show the way that the past informs our present. To really make the argument that almost nothing about modern American life has been left untouched by the legacy of slavery, even as we have tried to pretend that slavery is just an asterisk to the American story. So that's ultimately what led me to pitch the 1619 project, understanding that a single essay, a single story would not possibly be big enough. I wanted to show that across all of these very surprising aspects of American life, that we can trace them back to this original sin, and to answer that kind of quintessential question that every Black person in this country gets at some point, which is slavery was a long time ago, why don't you get over it? This project was the answer to that we cannot get over something that is foundational, and that our country has never gotten over it.
Well, thank you, Nikole. So one of the most exciting elements of the work for me is the 1619 project curriculum. It provides incredible resources for teachers to help students engage with the complexity of this nation's history. And as an historian, as a teacher, as an individual who grew up learning precious little about slavery, I see that curriculum as profoundly important. I have a 2-part question about it, and that is, was the curriculum part of your original vision for the project or something that developed later on? And why do you think it's so important to have created and to share that curriculum rather than letting the reporting speak for itself?
Yeah, so the curriculum was not part of the original concept for the project. And, I'm a journalist, and I was thinking about creating a work of journalism. And it wasn't until not too long before publication, we had discussed that this would be an important thing to learn in school. And clearly in my essay, I talk about what it felt like to be a Black student in school without having the benefit of a history of our people. But it wasn't part of my original concept. And it was towards the end, we started talking about that the Times does sometimes turn journalism into curriculum. And we started having conversations with the Pulitzer Center, which regularly turns journalism into curriculum. And that's when they said that they would love to work with us to on the 1619 Project to try to get access to it in schools and come up with learning guides and study guides and that sort of thing. So it wasn't original part of the plan, but clearly has become a huge part of the 1619 Project, and also of the concern amongst certain politicians and certain people who are really opposed to our children, our youth, getting a different understanding, a more challenging, and I would argue more accurate narrative about this country.
Right. And I want to talk about that in just a moment. Before we move there, I want to mention the title of this event, Perfecters of This Democracy. It plays on a really powerful facet of your essay on Black Americans and democracy. And you begin it with an anecdote about your father and the pristine American flag that he flew in your front yard. It was a puzzle to you originally, but then you came to understand it as a commentary on Black Americans' contributions to American nation building. I wonder if you could expand on that concept a bit, including the sense of pride that you described about the vital role of African Americans in American democracy.
Sure. So my piece, which can largely be seen as kind of the opening essay, the framing essay of the project, really talks about the unparalleled role that Black Americans have played in actually forming democracy in this country and forcing this country to live up to its founding ideals. And I'd like to actually start with a line at the end of the project, which says, what if in this 400th year, we finally realize that Black Americans are not the problem, but have always been the solution? What this essay really tries to do is turn on its head the way that we are raised, really indoctrinated to think about Black Americans as a problem to be solved. I talk about in the essay how if you Google the Negro problem, the Black problem, you will find an unending number of studies and research papers and pieces of literature that are trying to solve the problem of Black people. And I really wanted to begin this project by forcing a reframing in the mind of the reader of the way that we have been taught to think about Black Americans. And that actually Black Americans have been one of the greatest gifts to this country because it has been through our constant resistance that we actually have as much of a democracy as we can have. So I opened with the story of my dad and this flag that he flew in our front yard, and how as a teenager, I was deeply embarrassed by this outward show of patriotism from my father. I understood that Black Americans were still second-class citizens. This was a man who was born on a cotton plantation in apartheid Mississippi, one of the smartest men that I knew, but who never had any real opportunities in this country. And yet here he was exhibiting patriotism. He was a veteran. And, you know, we all hear these statistics about Black Americans overrepresentation in crime and overrepresentation in out of wedlock birth and all these statistics, but we never hear that Black Americans are also overrepresented in those who serve this country and who join the military. And that we actually join the military at the highest rates of all racial groups that has long been the case. And that we fought in every war that this country has ever fought. So my opening essay, really wants, from the moment you first start reading it, to get this sense of surprise about the way that we've been taught to think about this history in Black Americans. And really that I make the argument that our founders did not believe the words, those majestic words of the Declaration of Independence when they wrote them. Of course, some of the most famous words in the English language, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights, and of these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When those words were written, 1/5 of the population of the 13 colonies lived in absolute bondage and chattel slavery. Thomas Jefferson owned human beings, about 130 human beings, when he wrote those words, and in fact, had brought his own enslaved brother-in-law to Philadelphia with him to keep him comfortable as he wrote those words. But Black people read those words of the Declaration, and they saw those words as liberatory and applying to them. And Black people were determined that even though they knew those words weren't meant for them, that they were going to believe those words and that they were going to fight generation after generation to force this country to live up to those ideals. And that has been the role that Black Americans have played, really the unprecedented role of fighting for the expansion of democracy and suffrage and rights of citizenship for all marginalized groups. And what would it mean if our children grew up understanding that narrative about Black Americans and about their country, as opposed to the narrative that Black people have been and continue to be a problem? So that's really what the argument of the opening essay hope forces us to see the Black freedom struggle as actually a struggle for democracy for all Americans.
Mm-hmm. Well, that part of the essay resonated especially with me as an historian of the civil rights movement. I frequently observed the tremendous extent to which African Americans from a variety of backgrounds, activists, lawyers, veterans, as you say, and everyday people have invested so much energy in trying to achieve inclusion and belonging in America on its terms. So Dr. King famously said, be true to what you said on paper. So he's talking about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I think that point that you make so beautifully with the allusion to that story about the flag is really vitally important to understanding the protest tradition in African American history. Now, speaking of protest, let me go to the fact that partisan controversy has bubbled up about the 1619 Project this summer in the midst of protest over police violence. And Senator Tom Cotton and President Trump specifically took aim at the teaching of the curriculum. What do you think the pushback against the teaching of the curriculum is occurring now in the middle of nationwide protests against police violence nearly a year after the series was introduced?
So I think that one, we should understand that it's very clear that the Republicans, and particularly Donald Trump, have made the decision that they are going to run in this presidential campaign on racial animus and use that tactic that has long been used by politicians who felt that they were concerned about their chances of winning, which is to play on the racial divide. And the 1619 Sorry, I'm at home. And the 1619 Project has become one of those touch points where they feel that it is a winner to actually try to attack the project. And what I think the fear is, of course, and is that this is a project that does not play into the myth of American exceptionalism, that really is forcing us to acknowledge that the people in the streets right now are in the streets because we have failed to live up to our founding ideals. We have failed to live up to our founding creed. And in fact, that sin of slavery that we began on is still permeating our interactions today. So I think it's become a convenient touch point, frankly. I doubt that many of the people, including the politicians that are, coming out against the project, have read the project fully. I certainly don't think the president has read the 1619 Project, but I actually see this in a completely different light. What they have done by talking about the 1619 Project is they have forced Trump supporters to also know the year 1619 as well. Maybe they're reading the project, maybe they're not reading the project. But now that date as the marker of the beginning of slavery in this country, that date as a foundational date is also a part of their lexicon. So I actually feel deeply grateful that there was this fear around that project, and in trying to stoke fears, they've actually expanded the main premise of the project and have forced that date into the consciousness, even of those who don't agree with the arguments.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's consider some historians' reactions to the project. I would say that the majority of historians who have expressed a view have welcomed and praised the project, which I should know involved a number of my colleagues here at Harvard and Radcliffe. But a handful of high-profile historians took exception to a part of the project, the claim that preservation of slavery motivated some of the colonists who declared independence from Britain. You later modified your claim in the wake of that controversy, making clear that you were talking about some, not all. And obviously, the facts matter to historians, and that aspect of the controversy speaks for itself. I'm interested in something a little different, and that is the question of what is at stake, both for you and for these historical critics. Some say it's the difference between an account of American history that's premised on inevitable progress and one that concedes contest and dissent, including about what America means. And we've seen those kinds of interpretive debates about all manner of eras of history, the founding, progressivism, the civil rights movement, and so forth. And so I wonder, do you agree that the controversy is mostly about interpretation of history, or do you think that something else is going on there?
So, as a historian yourself, you know that argument is part of the field, that it is very natural and normal to expect, since historiography is not merely saying this thing happened on this date or this person did this thing on this date, but really about the interpretation of what do these facts and actions and times actually mean. That is very normal to expect that there's going to be disagreement. I certainly did not believe for a second that we would produce this project making the evocative arguments that we made, what would it mean to consider 1619 our founding and not 1776? Black people are the true founding fathers. That there would be no America without the Black presence, and not expect that there would be some pushback to that. And I certainly would never expect that every historian would agree with every argument that we made in the project. What, though, I think is different about what that small group of historians did was they didn't simply say, we wouldn't have written it this way. We don't agree with her interpretations on that fact, or, our argument about the period of the revolution. They could have easily said, most historians of that era said that that was overstated, even though let's all be clear here. I didn't sit down one day and decide I was going to make up some shit about the American Revolution. I actually got that from the work of historians. But what was different was the effort to really discredit the project, to make arguments, not just about that they didn't agree with certain facts, but, how could you say America is racist? How could you say racism is in the DNA of this country? How could you call Abraham Lincoln a racist? Which, by the way, I didn't call him a racist. I said he didn't believe in Black equality, which I think is pretty clear from reading his speeches and writings. So their main concern was really about, which is not a historical argument to me, is how do we see our country? Do we see our country as an exceptional nation, as a force for good and democracy that just had some minor flaws? Or do we see, and as you said, this idea that, yes, our founders had flaws, but we have always been moving towards those ideas and progressing towards an anti-racist society? Or is the true nature of our country a country that was founded on the belief that all people were not created equal and that we live with that result? I think that what I have learned since doing this project is that there are a lot of white historians, no matter what their political affiliations are, who feel the need to protect and vindicate our founding, who feel the need to say that we were founded as an exceptional and good nation and just deeply flawed. But that's not my role, and that's not my belief, and that's not an argument about history. That's an argument about what you want to choose to believe about our country. And I think it's quite natural that the descendants of those who enjoyed no rights or liberties at our founding, the descendants of those through forced torture and stolen labor, many of those founders were able to get the wealth and power to actually write those words, that our perspective would be different. And this was a project that was intentionally centering that perspective. So much of the criticism was not about facts or interpretations. It was about who has the right to tell the story of America, and what is the story of America that we believe is the right story.
Yeah. Well, so continuing along those lines, Nikole, it seems to me that a lot of the commentary about the 1619 Project is really about journalists' proper role in telling and interpreting history. And I wonder, and we've gotten many questions, particularly from students, about how you think about the journalist's role and responsibility in shaping these sorts of discussions, in particular in navigating the line between fact-finding and advocacy. Let's just use those words. How do you think about that?
Well, let's be clear. The 1619 Project is a work of journalism. It's clearly a work of journalism. It's a series of essays. It makes an argument. We state explicitly from the beginning that we are making an argument, and there's reporting. I mean, my essay opens with a story about my own father, a story about my own family. All of the essays begin with a modern phenomenon and reported from the present, and then they use history to tell this fuller story. So I never took that as a sincere argument, you know, the argument about who has the right to do this story, and that journalists should not be engaging in history, because one, we engaged in journalism and we researched history, which has been the basis of all of my journalism for the last 20 years. Most of my journalism spends a lot of time kind of reconstructing the past. That to me was always a gatekeeping type of argument about who has the right. I asked this of one of the critics of the 1619 Project in a historical forum not too long ago, that if historians don't want journalists and other lay people to use history, who are you writing history books for? It seems to me that the entire purpose of publishing historical text is to inform the non-academic historians so that they have a better understanding of their country and their world and are able to put that knowledge to use, which is what we tried to do with the 1619 Project. The other thing is, about half of the essays were written by historians and scholars, including scholars at some of the same schools that some of the historians who came out against the project teach at. So I think that all great journalism is deeply aware of history and does not pretend that the things that we're writing about right now are unrelated to decisions and actions and events that occurred in the past. And what made the 1619 Project so successful was that it wasn't a history. It was allowing people to understand America today. It was drawing these very clear connections. And what I've largely heard from historians is, thank you, because it helps people understand why we do what we do. And it has invigorated students wanting to engage in history because they see that it is actually relevant to the work that we do today and the society that we live in. So at my petty moments, I realized that a lot of the opposition, and you can see it in some of the words that the historians who opposed the project have said, was really about they should have been asked and consulted. And how dare, someone else tell these stories? And that's really in many ways what it comes down to. But I would hope that all historians do work because they want the broader American public to have a deeper understanding of history in our country. And this work cites dozens of historians and dozens of historical works. And what I hope is leads the average American to more introspection and to read the works of other scholars.
Yes. So let's accept journalism and the way you do it on its own terms, and ask you, Nikole, if there are particular journalists, contemporary or historical, who set the standard for you of what good journalism is.
Oh God, I hate whenever I get a question like this because you're always going to fail to list someone that you really should have listed had you not been on the spot. But clearly, the journalist whom I speak most frequently about is Ida B. Wells, and for a host of reasons. This was a Black woman who was engaging in journalism at a time when it was a dangerous and pretty unprecedented thing to do. But she was an innovator in techniques of investigative reporting. She also showed that why diversity in journalism is so critical, because Ida B. Wells single-handedly turned lynching into an issue of global concern. The common narrative at that time around lynchings in mainstream papers was that Black men were brutalizing white women and so therefore were deserving of being lynched. Ida B. Wells actually would go into a community that had just lynched a Black man or woman and start asking questions, and she started documenting the true reasons, which almost always was about maintaining caste or economic exploitation. She was one of the first data reporters. She created the first accounting of how many Black people were actually being lynched in this country. She innovated data reporting. So many of the techniques we use today around data reporting, around investigative reporting, were techniques that she innovated. And she also showed that black journalists could never pretend to be these neutral arbiters of fact, that when you were reporting in a country that did not believe you had full rights of citizenship, often reporting against the government that was actively discriminating against your people, that you couldn't pretend to have a distance and no opinion or thoughts on what you were reporting. And that to me is how I often feel about my reporting today. I don't pretend to objectivity. I think that the most important thing is my coverage fair and is my coverage accurate? But when I'm writing, for instance, about the segregation of Black children in schools, I'm not going to pretend that I don't think that that's immoral, because it is. So she's probably, the journalist who has had the greatest psychic impact on me as a journalist.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So let's go back to talking about academia. So the fundamental shift in perspective that the project demands is centering slavery in our country's history requires us to critically examine the history of American institutions. And it's notable that a consortium of universities has launched such an effort in recent years. Those universities include Georgetown, the University of Virginia, Brown University, and I'm pleased to say it includes Harvard. I mentioned in the opening that President Bacow established an initiative last year anchored at Radcliffe, building on work that President Emerita Drew Faust begun with historian Sven Becker and his students. So the question is, how do you think about these kinds of undertakings? Are there dimensions of slavery that these efforts might highlight that perhaps are missed when we only think about slavery in terms of governments or individual slaveholders?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the big things that these initiatives highlight is that slavery and its impact was a national endeavor. Of course, part of the mythology that begins at the end of slavery was that slavery was a Southern phenomena, and somehow that the South is not representative of America, that the true heart of America is the abolitionist North. But what that leaves out is that slavery was practiced in all 13 colonies, that slavery was practiced in places like New Jersey until 1865. New York State had slavery until 1827. So I think when we have these initiatives that force a place like Princeton or Harvard or Brown to really confront the legacy of slavery, but also the way that slavery was financing institutions in the North, the way that institutions like Harvard recruited students amongst the slave planter class in the South because those students could pay full tuition. I think it does a great deal of dispelling those myths about the limited nature of slavery and the limited results of slavery. I think that that's really critical. As for your other question, which is, of course, we hear, well, most Americans didn't own slaves and or that it is just the government that was at fault for allowing for the expansion of slavery really downplays the way that so many private institutions were built off of the money that was being produced by slavery. That even colleges were owning slaves often in the South, were investing in systems of mortgaging and insurance that actually was based off of slavery. So that is critical to our national conversation of understanding that this institution was really embedded across all types of American institutions in the North and the South. Because how can we have really a true reckoning without that acknowledgement that this was not a marginal institution? That is really what the 1619 Project is arguing, that this was a central institution and that there has been a great deal of myth making at the end of slavery that includes all the way up to the present time. Now, what I will say about these efforts, though, is the study, of course, is important, but the study is fairly useless to me if it does not lead to action. So what then action comes out of this outside of symbolic action, renaming a building or putting up a statue? That's not reparations. So to me, I feel as if all of these studies, if they're not ultimately leading to how do we then repair the harm that was done, that they're just about kind of a superficial showing and not about transformation.
Well, Nikole, that's an important point. Let me follow up by asking you, what do you think, after assuming universities establish, direct or indirect ties to slavery, what kind of repair work do you think is that suggests?
So at the very least, I have argued recently that universities need to offer a legacy admission program for the descendants of American slavery. The same way they have a legacy admission program that largely benefits white Americans because we were not allowed into most of these institutions until fairly recently, that if you are truly going to try to make amends, there has to be both financial and admission set-asides for the descendants. And let me be very clear, I'm not talking about a generalized affirmative action for all quote unquote people of color. I'm talking about a distinct program that is for the descendants of chattel slavery in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, and I saw some Twitter commentary about that. It's a very interesting point and goes back, at least in the law, to Bakke versus California, where the U.S. Supreme Court certainly emphasized, Justice Powell emphasized diversity over this inquiry around slavery. And it'll be interesting to see if the 1619 Project and other efforts opens that conversation up again around admissions. So let's talk about what is owed. The essay where you wrote that this moment in our history following the killing of George Floyd seems to hold a possibility for political and legal change to advance racial justice that similar moments have not. And you argue that reparations should be central to these efforts, and at the same time, you note that garnering political will, convincing enough Americans, and I'm quoting you, that the centuries-long forced economic disadvantage of Black Americans should be remedied is quite an upward climb. And so I want to ask you, what do you think the leverage is, or the point of interest convergence that would generate movement towards reparations, or at least broader conversations about the debt, what is owed, as you put it?
So interest convergence, I kind of, right. I always feel conflicted about this because I I hate that Black Americans are constantly in the position of having to convince white Americans that we are deserving of repair and our full rights of citizenship only if white Americans can figure out a way that it is beneficial to them, which is what interest convergence is. But unfortunately, we are 13% of the population of this country. So simply relying on a moral argument has not ever seemed to really work in this country, which is where that idea comes from. I think the idea of interest convergence is quite simple when it comes to reparations. And the argument is that it is not good for the financial well-being of our country to have 13% of your population held artificially low wealth and being, one catastrophe at all times away from homelessness and disaster, which is largely the experience of most Black Americans. And you can look at what has happened in cities and in schools where we have allowed for concentrated poverty and high degrees of segregation, that it is a destabilizing force across metro areas, and the harms are not ever contained just to Black Americans. I try to make that argument in one of the essays in the 1619 project, for instance, on healthcare. Why we're the only Western industrialized country without universal health care, why we have the stingiest social safety net of all Western industrialized countries, shortest maternity leave, right? Less access to quality, cheap health care. If you get sick and you're white and uninsured, you also can't go to the hospital. And that this stinginess around a common good and public good is directly linked to anti-Black racism. So I try to make that argument there that anti-Blackness actually doesn't just harm Black people, it harms Black people the most, but it harms all Americans. So the interest convergence that I hope will come out of this is Black people will do with reparations what every other group does with their wealth. They will invest in education. They will invest in home ownership. They will invest in small businesses. And that this will actually create a sounder, a more healthy economy and a more healthy society. Unfortunately, I think we have the inequality we have because this is what most white Americans have been satisfied for us to maintain. Because segregation, it is important to understand that slavery was not about racism. Slavery was about economically exploiting Black labor. And Jim Crow was not about racism. Jim Crow was about keeping an economically exploitable labor force. And the racism, of course, develops to justify economic exploitation. And to this day, when we look at the way that race still operates in employment, in housing, in schools, it is still to maintain an economic hierarchy amongst white Americans. And I think it is very hard to convince them that this is something that should be given up. What I hear all the time when I talk about reparations for the legacy of chattel slavery and the 100 years of racial apartheid that followed is, what about poor white people? Or why should Black people get something when other people are struggling? There is an inability to really accept the singularity of the Black experience. And a feeling always, which has always been the case historically, that if Black people are getting ahead, someone else must be losing out. I don't know how we get past that. And my argument isn't suggesting that we will, but that we should.
So Nikole, I want to move to audience Q&A, and I'll start with this one. I love the fact that she, Nikole, is at home and has the same issues being interrupted by children or other household members as the rest of us.
My child was my husband in this case, but okay.
Rest of us normal folks. And so this audience member noticed that you have actual record albums in your bookshelves, and she wants to know what your favorite music is to listen to while you're writing.
So thank you for that question. And yes, this isn't the worst thing that's happened on one of these virtual talks. My daughter actually set off the fire alarm once because she was burned some oatmeal on the stove. So yeah, me having to cuss my husband out and tell him to stop being loud is not the worst. But I do think that this pandemic has taught all of us to have a little bit more grace with each other. And so I think that's a beautiful thing. These records behind me are my dad's record collection. It's one of the few things of value that my father actually had when he died. And it's the thing that reminds me the most of him, because we would listen to all of those albums together, and he really passed on his love of music to me. And now my daughter knows many of these 70s and 80s songs as well, because I play the record, particularly when I get in a certain melancholy mood. I like to play the records. What do I write to? It really depends. I write a lot to 90s R&B. I write to hip hop. It depends on what mood I'm trying to get in. Do I want to feel angry? Do I want something that's more kind of background that I can kind of zone out on, or do I want something that's putting my mind into a certain state when I'm writing? So it largely depends on what I'm feeling. Okay. That was a cool question. I don't usually get cool questions like that, so I appreciate it.
Well, I thought it was one that to start with. So some other questions. I'm curious about the process of assembling all the pieces in this project. Did you solicit all the pieces? Were some pitched to you? And someone wants to know about just the journalistic process behind the 1619 project.
Yes, thank you for that question. I love talking craft as well. So when I pitched the project, there were a handful of essays that I knew needed to be part of the project. I knew there needed to be an essay on democracy. I knew that there needed to be an essay on capitalism and universal health care. So those were the three areas that I knew I wanted to assign. One of the first things I did when I got the green light was I actually, despite all the criticism, convened a panel of scholars. And these were historians, sociologists, art historians, people whose work has had a deep influence on me and whose work has informed my own work. So I called together a panel of historians and told them the conceit, which was, we want to take some modern American phenomenon that most people think has nothing to do with slavery and use history to show, to reveal that connection and to explain this modern phenomenon. And I asked these scholars to come, and we had a big brainstorming session. And out of that session, we also had a big internal brainstorming session with different editors and staff writers at the Times. And then out of those two sessions, we came up with just this huge list of stories, and then slowly culled those stories down to about 10 that we thought were the best, most evocative, most surprising, and that we could make the best historical arguments with. Some of those stories I assigned, and then some of them were pitched by the people who wrote them. So for instance, Khalil Muhammad at Harvard pitched the story on sugar, and he wrote that story. Kevin Cruz, who did the story on traffic, he pitched that story at that brainstorming meeting, and we assigned that to him. Taya Miles, also at Harvard, I had read her work on Native and Black slavery in Detroit, and so we assigned her. So it was a mix of stories that I knew that I wanted just from my own study and research, and then stories that were pitched to us by different scholars. And for instance, the music piece that I assigned, I knew there was no one else I was going to ask to write that than Wesley Morris, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning critic at the time. So it was a process, and that's why I felt really strongly about what we ultimately produced, because was a ton of thought into selecting both who would write and what would be written.
Okay. So there are a lot of questions about the curriculum, Nikole. Let me give you a two. I work in a private high school, and I'm committed to anti-racist pedagogy. Given the segregationist roots of private schools, and given that some private schools may be able to open at the current moment while public schools are not, do you think the goals of anti-racism are in opposition to or compatible with private school education?
So there's like 5 questions in that one. So one, not all private schools have their basis in segregation, but people who know my work know that in general, I am opposed to private schools. I actually, as much as I write about the failings of public education, I am a deep believer in the democratizing effect of public education, and that we need that the public schools are one of the few places left in American society where we have the chance to intimately mix along racial and class lines, that almost all of those spaces are now gone. And that this is the greatest gift that we can give each other as citizens, is to have our children educated together in common free schools, where the wealthiest person and the poorest person get the same education. We've never lived up to that ideal, but I believe strongly in that. So I'm never going to be a defender of private schools. And I've long wished that the Supreme Court did one of the most radical steps that it considered after Brown v. Board, which was the considering of abolishing private schools. So yes, I think they play clearly a huge role in both societal inequality, school inequality, and really our inability to be a truly multiracial democracy. With that said, they are going to exist, and people are going to teach in them, and people are going to attend them. So as much as we can use those schools as a platform to create a society that is concerned about the greater good and equality, then we should.
Mm-hmm. So teach 1619 in private schools. So there's another question about whether an elementary school curriculum is planned for the 1619 project, age appropriate, structured, etc.
So I know that there's at least one group that has contacted the Pulitzer Center about trying to create a 1619 curriculum. There's also a university here in New York City that has begun to work on that. I don't know when it might actually be available. We also are producing a series of children's books that will be from young reader to middle grades to high school. And those will begin to roll out next year. So that can kind of be a starting point for teaching this to younger grades. So the short answer is yes. I know that there are some folks working on that. I don't know when that curriculum will be available.
Okay, good to know.
I hear you guys have a good education school there, though. So,
we have
someone there could always take that up.
We have an excellent school. I'll talk to Bridget. The dean, considering America's founding on inequality and inequity with respect to Black people, one audience member wants to know, can we ever truly achieve racial equity in America?
So I get that question a lot. And what I would say is what is possible and what is probable are clearly two different things. Can we? Of course we can. I mean, all of this inequality was constructed. So all of this inequality can be deconstructed. Is that probable? I don't think so. The 1619 Project commemorates 400 years. Anti-Blackness predates the founding of our country by 150 years. We have a president in the White House right now who's running on a pretty openly white nationalist campaign and who still has a good chance of winning, and who will likely win the majority of the white vote. So I don't think that, this is why some of the scholars who disagree with the project really hated the metaphor I used about slavery being in the DNA, or anti-Blackness and slavery being in the DNA of our country, because DNA is basically impossible to purge. But I will note, David Blight also used that DNA analogy, and they didn't attack him. But I think we want to believe that it can be purged. I'm sure that it can, but I don't believe that we will, no. There's nothing about the last 400 years of history that would lead me to believe that this society as is, without some, massive revolution that would have to be far more successful than the Civil War was in that aspect, or the Civil Rights Movement was in that aspect, will be able to purge us from what is really the basis upon which this country was built. but we could.
Mm-hmm. So another question has to do with what gives you hope about the future, about this country, about the status of Black Americans?
Oh, Lord. I always get asked the hope question too. I feel like Americans in particular are obsessed with hope, and I get it, right? I feel hope about things that I can control myself, and what can I provide for my child, and what will my child's life be? What can I do for my community? I feel hope in that way. I don't feel a lot of hope for things that are outside of my control, which is most of the world and most of what leads Black Americans to suffer in the ways that we suffer. I think that hope is useful, of course, and I clearly can map the trajectory of my own family. My grandmother spending most of her early life and early adulthood on a cotton plantation, and her entire adult life cleaning for white people, and my father who didn't even graduate high school, and here I am at the New York Times talking to all of y'all. So I can clearly see progress, and that my daughter won't know any of the financial struggles that I knew growing up, that her life is so completely different from even my own childhood. And I think about, someone like John Lewis, one of the greatest Americans this country ever produced, who was born also on a sharecropping farm, plantation in a cotton picking family that was not able to get an education, and who couldn't have believed that he could help topple segregation one day, and yet he did. And yet, a few weeks before he died, he had to be out in the streets, still proclaiming that Black Lives Matter, still trying to fight for the rights of all Americans to vote that he had fought for when he was nearly beaten to death. So for me, hope is useful for a lot of people. I don't find it to be that useful in my own life, because I think that as long as people can have hope, then we don't act to dismantle all of the desperate and really immoral inequality that people are experiencing right now, because we have hope that one day it will be better. It's called the 1619 Project because Black people have been here for 400 years, and the time to mark incremental progress is just past. Like I cannot get excited anymore by people saying, well, at least things aren't as bad as they used to. Yeah. When do we just get equality after 400 years? And what hope is there of that? So
yes,
I get that question all the time. Other people should remain hopeful. It's not that useful to me.
Well, we should, we'll have to end there.
End on that light note.
I want to thank you, Nikole, for being with us this afternoon and for prompting such an important national conversation through your work. Thanks as well to everyone who tuned in, to all of our generous supporters. And I'll conclude today by emphasizing that today's program is a beginning, not an end. I encourage all of you to engage with us as we continue our efforts here at Harvard to reckon with slavery and its legacies, and to expand understanding at Radcliffe through interdisciplinary engagement with the world. You can learn more about our work as well as all of Radcliffe's public programs on our website. Thank you again for joining us, and have a nice evening.
Thank you all.